I still remember that camping trip in Montana like it happened last week. It was one of those trips that starts off perfectly warm weather, a wide open field surrounded by distant tree lines, and that peaceful quiet you only get in the middle of nowhere. I had gone out there with a small group of people, but by the second night, everyone had turned in early, and I found myself lying in my tent, listening to the grass swaying outside and feeling that deep calm that comes right before sleep. We'd picked a spot in a huge open grassy area. There weren't many trees nearby, just rolling land and sky stretching endlessly in all directions. The air had been dry all day, the kind of dryness that makes the horizon shimmer in the sun. When evening came, the temperature dropped sharply, and a cold breeze started rolling across the plains. It carried that heavy smell of wet air, the kind that always comes before rain. I didn't think much of it. I zipped the tent flap shut, lay down, and listened to the faint rustle of the wind moving through the grass. Not long after, I started noticing faint flashes against the inside of the tent. At first, I thought it was someone's flashlight outside, maybe one of the other campers wandering around. But the flashes kept coming, too regular and too bright. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, and that's when I saw it, far in the distance. A storm was brewing. You could see the clouds building on the horizon, huge dark shapes forming in the sky, glowing from within as lightning crawled through them. There was no sound yet, just the light, silent, white bursts flashing across the landscape, lighting up the grass in ghostly waves. It looked like something alive, like the sky itself was breathing. I crawled out of the tent and stood there for a while, barefoot in the cool grass, watching. The air was still dry where I stood, but you could feel the electricity building, tiny hairs on my arms standing up, a faint tingling in the air. I remember thinking it was beautiful, that mix of fear and awe when nature shows its full power. The first sound came a few minutes later, a low rumble rolling across the open field, deep enough to vibrate in my chest. Then another flash, closer this time, followed almost instantly by a crack so loud it made my ears ring. That was when I realized how close the storm actually was. I rushed back into the tent and zipped it up tight. The wind started picking up quickly after that, turning from a light breeze into strong gusts that pressed against the thin walls of the tent. The sound of it was like waves crashing on a shore, only sharper, more chaotic. I could hear the grass bending and whipping around, and then came the rain. It didn't start slow. 1 second, it was only wind, and the next, it was sheets of rain pounding down, hitting the tent so hard that I could see its outline pressing inward with every gust. I could barely hear anything but the noise, the relentless drumming of water, the wind howling through the open plains, and the thunder that now seemed to come from every direction at once. Then the lightning started striking close. The flashes were so bright they turned everything white, even with my eyes closed. It wasn't like the soft flicker you see from far away. It was blinding, an explosion of light that left dark shapes dancing across my vision long after. Each strike was followed instantly by a crack that felt like it split the air apart. I lay flat in the tent, trying to make myself small, trying not to move. Every time lightning hit nearby, the ground seemed to tremble slightly under me. I could feel the vibrations through the thin layer of dirt beneath the sleeping pad. The air smelled sharp, metallic, ozone. It was as if the whole world was charged with electricity. At some point, I realized how dangerous my situation was. I was camping in the middle of a wide open field with no real cover, surrounded by wet ground and metal tent poles. It was one of those stupid realizations that only hits after it's too late to do anything. The only trees were hundreds of feet away, and the ground between was soaked and uneven. Leaving the tent now would mean running through open ground under lightning that was hitting close enough to blind me. I stayed put. For what felt like hours, the storm stayed directly above. Lightning would flash, thunder would explode, and the wind would twist and shift, slamming into the tent from new directions every few minutes. Rain leaked through tiny seams and ran down the sides, pooling near my sleeping bag. The air inside was damp, humid, and heavy. There was a moment when one strike hit so close that it felt like it landed inside my skull. The light burst white-hot, brighter than daylight, and the sound followed instantly, so loud it felt physical. I couldn't hear anything for a few seconds afterward except a dull ringing. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. After that one, I could smell burning grass somewhere nearby. Just faintly, under the smell of rain and dirt. The air outside sizzled with electricity, like the whole field had become a live wire. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, listening to the wind thrash through the canvas above me, wondering if the next one would hit closer. The storm lasted deep into the night. Eventually, the thunder began to stretch out, each rumble fading longer before the next one came. The flashes moved farther away, and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. By the time I felt safe enough to unzip the tent, the entire world around me looked different. The storm clouds were breaking apart, drifting west, and the sky above them glowed faintly gray. The field was soaked, puddles glimmering in the faint starlight. I stepped out barefoot again, and the mud squished cold between my toes. Steam was rising off the wet ground, curling into the air like smoke. The silence that followed was unreal. After hours of constant noise, the quiet felt deafening. The air was perfectly still, no wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dripping of rain from the tent's edge. I looked around and realized I could see where some of the lightning had hit. A patch of grass about 20 yards away was blackened and smoking slightly, the blades bent outward from the point of impact. Another spot farther off had a similar burn mark, a faint glow of dying embers still visible. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, staring at the scars in the earth. It was one of those rare moments when fear and awe become the same thing. I had never felt smaller in my life. The storm had come out of nowhere, unleashed itself right on top of me, and then vanished as if it had never existed. When the first light of dawn started creeping over the hills, the field looked peaceful again. You would never have guessed that hours earlier it had been chaos. The sky was clear, brightening into pale gold. Birds started calling from the distant tree line. The wet grass sparkled under the sunlight, and the burned patches were the only sign left of what had happened. I made coffee on the small camp stove, sitting cross-legged in front of the tent. The air smelled clean in that way it only does after rain, earthy and sharp, like everything had been washed new. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky. It's strange how quickly nature can turn. One moment you're lying under calm skies, and the next, you're in the middle of something that could kill you in seconds. It wasn't horror in the way most people think of it. No monsters, no strange noises, no danger that could be reasoned with. It was something deeper, something that reminded me how powerless we really are when the world decides to remind us who's in charge. That night changed the way I think about camping. I still go, but I never underestimate what the sky can do anymore. I never camp in the middle of open ground, no matter how beautiful it looks. I never forget how it felt lying there, blinded by light even with my eyes closed, waiting for the next strike, wondering if it would be me this time. When people ask me if I've ever had a scary experience outdoors, I tell them about that night. Not because I was in danger of something unnatural, but because I realized what true fear feels like when it comes from something completely natural. It's quiet, unstoppable, and entirely indifferent to whether you're ready or not. That storm in Montana didn't just pass over me. It went through me, and I've never forgotten how small I felt standing in its aftermath, alive only because the lightning chose a patch of grass instead of me. It was sometime in late spring when my boyfriend and I decided to go camping out in Texas. We'd been looking for somewhere quiet, away from everything. No campgrounds with screaming kids or crowded RVs, just trees, dirt, and the kind of silence that only happens far from people. We found a primitive camping area on a map, one of those spots with barely visible paths cutting through the woods. You could drive through parts of it if your car had decent clearance, but mostly it was just wild, unkempt land. We packed light, a small tent, sleeping bags, a little cooler, and our dog, a mid-sized mixed breed who loved being outside. The air that evening was warm, still, and heavy with that faint sweetness you get before a storm. The dirt path was uneven and rough, bouncing us around until we found a flat spot about 20 yards off the main trail. It was surrounded by trees but still open enough for a small fire pit. The place felt remote. There was no one else around, at least not within shouting distance. We set up the tent, collected wood, and got a small fire going. The crackling and smoke made the woods feel alive but comforting. It was quiet in that vast, empty Texas way. Cicadas droning, the occasional hoot of an owl, our dog sniffing around the perimeter like it was his job. As the light faded, the trees went black against the deep orange of the sky, and the firelight flickered on our faces. We weren't drunk, we weren't high. We were just sitting there, talking quietly, roasting a few things. The dog curled near our feet. That was when a set of headlights appeared out of nowhere, coming down the dirt path toward us. They were bright, too bright, and pointed directly at our camp. The engine rumbled low, slow. The vehicle pulled right up to our sight, close enough that the beams lit up our entire campsite like a stage. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The light was blinding. I couldn't see the shape of the vehicle or who was inside. It just sat there, idling, the sound deep and steady. My heart started hammering. I felt completely exposed, like whoever was out there could see everything. Our tent, our gear, even the outline of our faces, while we couldn't see anything at all. It stayed that way for maybe a minute or two. Then, without a word or any sound other than the shifting of gears, the lights turned and the vehicle backed up, pulling slowly away down the path. The darkness rushed back in, heavy and sudden. We sat there for a while afterward, waiting to hear if it would come back. Didn't. Eventually, the fire burned lower, and the silence returned. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone thought we were in their usual camping spot, maybe they got lost, maybe it was nothing. But something about how close they'd come and how long they'd sat there watching didn't feel right. Later, when we climbed into the tent, the forest felt different. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful anymore, just tense. The dog shifted a lot, restless. My boyfriend fell asleep quickly, his breathing even. Couldn't. Every sound outside made me tense up. The distant rustle of leaves, a faint snap of a branch. I kept glancing at the tent walls, lit faintly by the dying fire. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to the distant sound of an engine. It was a low, uneven growl at first, then sharper, the distinct buzz of an ATV. It was close, maybe 100 yards away. I could hear it weaving through the woods, the tires crunching dirt and leaves. My stomach dropped. The noise grew louder until it was right outside the tent. The engine idled maybe 20 feet away. I could see the shadows shifting through the thin fabric of the tent as the headlights swept across it. The whole inside glowed white for a few seconds. I didn't breathe. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the faint tremble of the tent fabric in the wind. Then, just as suddenly, the sound faded. The ATV turned and drove off, the noise growing smaller and smaller until it was gone. I waited for a while, listening. Nothing else happened. My boyfriend and the dog slept through it like nothing was wrong. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, trying to convince myself it was a random hunter, someone exploring late. But the feeling in my chest said otherwise. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted back to sleep, though it felt like a light, uneasy kind of half-sleep. Couldn't have been more than an hour or two later when I woke again, this time to several engines. Multiple ATVs. I could hear at least 3 or 4 of them, the sounds surrounding us from different directions. The noise was close, too close, and getting closer fast. The headlights hit the tent again, brighter this time, and stayed there. I sat up instantly, shaking my boyfriend awake. The engines idled all around us, rumbling low and steady, the sound of metal and tires grinding on dirt. I peeked through the zipper just enough to see outside, and my chest tightened. They were right there, for ATVs, maybe more, parked around our camp in a rough semicircle. The riders were just sitting on them, not moving, not speaking, just facing our tent. Their headlights cut through everything. The tent, the trees, our gear, even the dog, who was awake now, growling low in his throat. I couldn't make out faces, just dark outlines behind the lights. We didn't have a gun. The most dangerous thing in reach was a dull machete we used for clearing branches. I remember gripping it without even realizing, my hands slick with sweat. My boyfriend sat up, wide-eyed now, and we just stared at each other. I felt that kind of fear that locks up every part of your body, where every sound seems too loud, Every second feels like forever. They just sat there. Engines rumbling, lights blinding. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. I could feel the heat of the headlights even through the thin tent fabric. Could smell the faint stench of exhaust drifting through the air. Then one of them revved the engine and started moving forward, slow and steady, creeping closer toward the tent. The others stayed put. The sound of the tires grinding the dirt grew louder. That was the moment something in me broke loose. All the fear twisted into anger, and I just snapped. I jumped up, unzipped the tent, and shouted as loud as I could, my voice raw and shaking but full of adrenaline. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing back at us. And then silence. The engines went quiet all at once, one by one. The headlights flickered, and before I could take another breath, they turned and drove off. The roar of the engines faded into the woods, swallowed by the dark until there was nothing but the soft crackle of what was left of our campfire. We sat there frozen for a long time, waiting to see if they'd come back. The dog kept growling quietly, ears pinned back. Every distant sound felt like the start of another engine, but nothing else came. When we finally moved, it was only to pack. Every motion was fast but quiet. Rolling up sleeping bags, tearing down the tent, throwing gear into the car without bothering to organize anything. The headlights of our own car felt too bright, too loud. We drove out of there without speaking, following the dirt path back to the main road, every shadow between the trees looking like someone standing there watching. When we reached the highway, I finally looked back. The forest was dark, completely still, no signs of light or movement, just black trees against the faint glow of dawn. I've thought about that night a lot since then, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a group of locals messing with campers, maybe drunk or bored, or maybe it was something else, people who knew how far out we were, how isolated. Whatever it was, they knew exactly how to make us feel helpless. The headlights, the timing, the way they surrounded us without a word. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I've camped plenty since then, but never in a place that remote. Never without knowing who else is nearby. That night showed me how fragile comfort is out in the woods, how quickly the quiet can turn into something else entirely. We were lucky they left. Lucky that shouting worked. Because the truth is, if they hadn't, there wasn't a single thing we could have done. We were alone, miles from help, sitting in a thin piece of fabric in the dark while engines circled us like wolves. Sometimes, when I think about it, I still hear that sound. The deep, mechanical growl of those ATVs closing in through the trees, and the way the night swallowed it after they were gone. I was 12 years old the day it happened, and I don't think there's been a single year since that I haven't thought about it. It was the fall of 1977, and my older brother Dan had taken me hiking at Point Reyes, up in Northern California. He was 17 then, tall and athletic, the kind of brother who seemed fearless to me. I was the kid tagging along, trying to keep up, trying to act older than I was. It was one of those cool, windy coastal days when everything smelled like salt and pine. The air had that sharpness that makes your eyes water a little, and the sky was a pale gray sheet with streaks of white cloud moving fast. I remember the sound of the ocean somewhere far below us, hidden behind the cliffs and trees, and the crunch of our boots on the dirt trail. Dan had planned the hike. He said Point Reyes had the best views, and he wanted to show me the cliffs that dropped right into the ocean. We parked at a small dirt lot with only 2 other cars and started down the trail, cutting through low brush and stretches of cypress trees. The trail wound up and down, sometimes narrow enough that we had to walk single file. I remember how quiet it was. No other hikers, no voices, just wind and the occasional cry of a bird. I didn't know it at the time, but there had been murders in that park that year. Women, mostly. A few hikers had gone missing too. The local news talked about it, but I didn't really pay attention. Dan knew, though. He had that older brother protectiveness about him, even when he didn't show it directly. I think that's why he brought a small knife in his backpack. We had been walking for maybe 2 hours when the trail curved around a bend that led into a thicker patch of woods. The trees here grew closer together, the light dimming as the branches overlapped. The air felt cooler in there, still like the wind couldn't reach it. The smell of wet leaves replaced the salty air, and the sound of the ocean faded behind us. We were walking quietly, and I remember feeling a strange tension in my chest, like something was off, but I couldn't say what. The woods were too quiet. Not a bird, not an insect, just the sound of our boots. And then, ahead of us, someone stepped out from behind the curve of the trail. At first, I thought it was a ranger or another hiker, but as soon as I saw him, every hair on my body stood up. He was tall, incredibly tall, at least a head taller than Dan, who was already 6'3". His clothes were simple. Dark pants, a hooded sweatshirt pulled over his head, hands at his sides. But it was his face that stopped me cold. His skin was pale, white in a way I'd never seen before, almost colorless. His eyebrows and eyelashes were invisible, and when his eyes met mine, they looked like glass. Pale gray, nearly clear, but cold. Cold in a way that didn't make sense, like looking into a reflection of ice. We froze in place for a second. The trail wasn't wide enough to pass without getting close, and he was coming straight toward us. My stomach tightened, and I remember Dan's arm brushing against mine as if he was ready to step in front of me. He leaned close and whispered something, but the only word I caught was, "Don't." I couldn't look away. The man walked toward us slowly, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not breaking contact for even a moment. He didn't look angry. He didn't look curious either. He looked empty, like whatever was behind those eyes wasn't thinking about us at all, just observing. I tried to be polite, to make it normal somehow, and I muttered a quiet hi as we passed. He didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear. He just kept walking, brushing past us, and for a brief second, I felt the air shift, the smell of something sharp and metallic, like old pennies or wet stone. His clothes made no sound when he moved, and his steps were slow, measured, like he didn't have anywhere to be. We kept walking after that, a little faster, not saying anything. My heart was pounding so loud I could feel it in my neck. When we were a few yards away, I turned around just to see him again to make sure he was still there. But he was gone. There wasn't anywhere for him to go. The trail behind us was long and open, bordered by thick brush that rustled faintly in the wind. No sound of footsteps, no movement, nothing. He had vanished completely. Dan turned too, and for the first time I saw him look unsure. He scanned the trail, the trees, even the slope beside us. But there was no sign of the man. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking behind him, feeling smaller than I ever had, glancing back every few steps. The rest of the hike was quiet. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every shadow between trees looked like something moving. Every gust of wind sounded like a breath behind us. When we reached the cliffs overlooking the ocean, we stopped to catch our breath. The water below was rough, waves smashing against the rocks, spraying white foam into the air. The horizon stretched endlessly gray, and the clouds above it were heavy and dark. It should have been beautiful, but I couldn't stop thinking about that man. His pale face, the way he moved, the silence that followed him. We didn't stay long. The wind picked up and we headed back, this time taking a shorter route to the parking lot. We didn't see anyone else that day, not a single hiker. When we finally reached the car, I remember Dan checking the back seat before unlocking it. I didn't ask why. The drive home was quiet. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. I didn't realize until later how tense he had been the whole time. That night, when I was back home lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face. The colorless skin, the hollow eyes, the way his body seemed too long, too stretched out. And that cold feeling, the air around him that felt wrong somehow, like stepping too close to something you weren't supposed to see. Years later, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a tall hiker with albinism. Maybe my mind exaggerated his height or the look in his eyes. But no explanation ever really made sense. The way he disappeared didn't fit. The trail was open. There was nowhere to hide, not without making noise. When I was older, I read more about that time, about the murders that had happened in Point Reyes during the mid to late 1970s. Women found in the woods, trails nearby, no suspects ever caught. A few hikers reported strange encounters. Men who followed them, figures seen in the fog. None of it ever led anywhere. I sometimes wonder if the man we saw had anything to do with it. If he was one of those people the police never found. If maybe we'd crossed paths with someone who wasn't supposed to be there at all. Even now, when I hike, I can't shake that instinct I learned that day. The need to look behind me every so often. The quick glance around every bend before stepping forward. I've been in storms, close to bears, lost trails, but nothing has ever chilled me like that simple moment. The flash of those pale eyes in the dim forest light, the way he kept walking as if we weren't even real to him. Sometimes I think about how my brother said, "Don't look at him." How he must have seen something in that man's face that I didn't understand then. It's been decades since that hike, but I can still see that narrow trail, the damp leaves underfoot, the thin light filtering through the trees. I can still see that man's shape coming around the bend, slow and silent. And I can still feel that cold air pressing against my skin, the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather, but from realizing for the first time that the world can hold people who don't look at you like you're a person at all. It happened about 16 years ago, but I still remember the smell of it, the look of it, the way the world seemed to stop when I realized what I was seeing. It was one of those moments that doesn't make sense no matter how long you think about it. I wasn't a kid then, but I wasn't old either, maybe mid-20s, living in Vancouver, Washington, where I grew up. I used to spend a lot of time hiking and camping around the local creeks and forested areas, especially the ones far enough from town that you didn't hear cars or see any power lines. I liked that kind of isolation, the quiet that feels like it's swallowing you whole. That weekend I was hiking alone, following a small freshwater creek that twisted through a patch of dense woods about 2 miles from the nearest road. It wasn't a big creek, more like a thin ribbon of clear, cold water cutting through mud and rocks, with overhanging roots and fallen branches crisscrossing above it. You could hear it before you saw it, that soft trickle and gurgle that never quite stops. The kind of sound that gets into your head and blends with the wind and birds until it becomes background noise. The air smelled damp, earthy, the way Pacific Northwest forests always do. Moss covered nearly everything, tree trunks, rocks, even some of the logs half buried in the mud. The sun was just starting to break through the canopy here and there, and the air was cool but not uncomfortable. It felt like any other quiet morning in the woods. I was walking upstream, boots slipping a little in the wet soil, keeping an eye out for animal tracks or anything interesting. I used to collect small things I found, old bottles, feathers, weird rocks. I'd usually bring a small backpack just for that. The creek wasn't deep, maybe a foot at most in most spots, but it was clean and fast-moving. You could see small fish darting under rocks now and then. It was about an hour into my walk when I saw it. At first, it didn't register. There was just a reddish shape tangled against a root mass near the bend of the creek ahead. From where I stood, it looked like maybe a piece of fabric or plastic that had washed downstream and caught on something. The color stood out against the greens and browns around it. A dull, brick red, wet and glistening under the weak sunlight. As I got closer, the smell hit me. It was thick, heavy, and sour, like rotting fish and something metallic underneath it. I've smelled plenty of dead animals in the woods before. Deer, raccoons, even birds. But this was different. It was sharper, saltier somehow, even though we were miles from the ocean. I stopped walking for a second, trying to place it. When I stepped closer, I saw what it really was. It took a moment for my brain to make sense of the shape. A large, red, dead octopus was tangled in the roots at the edge of the creek. It didn't move, but the current made its arms shift slightly in the water, like something still alive. I remember just staring at it, frozen. The color was dark red, fading in spots where the skin looked torn or dried. Its body was about the size of a basketball, and the arms, 8 of them unmistakably, were long and limp, maybe 2 or 3 feet each, their pale undersides covered in circular suckers. It didn't make any sense. I stood there for what felt like a long time, the sound of the creek running beside it, the faint wind moving through the trees. There was no salt water anywhere near here. The nearest stretch of ocean was 70 miles west. Even the Columbia River, which is big enough for some strange things to drift into, was miles away. This was a small, narrow, pure freshwater creek running through the woods. No boats, no traffic, Just mud, trees, and fish the size of your fingers. I squatted down beside it, careful not to touch it, and looked closer. The smell was strong enough to sting my nose. Flies had started to gather around it, crawling across the skin. It looked like it had been dead for a few days, maybe 3 or 4. Parts of it were bloated, and one side of the mantle had a small tear in it where you could see inside. It was one of the most unnatural things I'd ever seen in that kind of place. My first thought was that maybe some animal had brought it here. Maybe an eagle or a heron. There are some big birds around those woods, and they'll sometimes grab fish from rivers or lakes. But an octopus? That didn't add up. They live deep in salt water. Even if a bird managed to snatch one up near the coast, why carry it 70 miles inland and drop it in a tiny creek in the middle of nowhere? The only other thought I had was that maybe someone had done it. Maybe someone caught one, brought it home, and then dumped it here for some reason. Or maybe it was some kind of prank or an attempt to set it free. Like those people who release goldfish into ponds without realizing they can't survive there. But this was far, far from anywhere. You'd have to hike a long way to reach this spot. Carrying a dead octopus that whole way didn't make sense either. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The whole forest seemed to grow quieter around me. The wind had stopped, and I could hear the faint buzzing of the flies and the slow trickle of water around the octopus's arms. The air smelled thicker now, mixed with decay and mud. I walked upstream a bit, looking for any signs that it had been dumped. Footprints, drag marks, anything. But the ground was mostly packed dirt and covered in leaves. Nothing, just forest floor. No human tracks, no tire marks from a bike or ATV, nothing that would suggest someone had come through recently. When I came back to where it lay, I noticed the way its arms draped downstream, the water sliding over them in thin sheets. It looked strange, beautiful in a way but also wrong, like something that belonged to a different world entirely. Its red color looked almost fake against the dark brown water, and for a second I had the oddest thought that maybe I was the first person to ever see something like that here. I didn't touch it. I didn't take a picture either. I just stared at it for a long while, trying to understand it, until the smell became too strong and I couldn't stand there anymore. I turned back and started hiking out, but I remember glancing over my shoulder several times. I don't even know what I expected. To see it move, maybe, or to see someone else standing there. But it stayed the same, motionless, half submerged in that slow-moving creek. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every sound in the forest seemed louder. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the faint snap of twigs under my boots. I felt watched, though I knew there was no one around. That feeling stayed with me until I reached the road again, and even after that I couldn't shake it. For days afterward, I kept thinking about it. I looked up anything I could find, news about animal dumping, strange wildlife reports, even local stories. Nothing. No mention of anyone finding something similar. No missing specimen from an aquarium or anything like that. It was like it had appeared out of nowhere. Eventually, I went back to the same spot about a week later, more out of curiosity than anything. The creek was lower then, and the weather had turned warmer. I found the same bend, the same cluster of roots, but the octopus was gone. There was no sign of it at all. No bones, no remains, not even a stain in the water. Either someone had come and taken it, or the current had finally pulled it loose and carried it downstream. I followed the water for a while, but it disappeared into thicker brush and marshy ground. To this day, I still don't know how it got there. I've told a few people over the years, and most of them don't believe me. But I know what I saw. I can still see the color of it in my head, that deep, unnatural red against the brown water. I can still smell it. Sometimes when I hike near water now, I catch myself scanning the edges, half expecting to see something that doesn't belong. Something torn from a place it should have never been. It's strange how something like that sticks with you. Not because it was dangerous or violent, but because it was so out of place, so quietly wrong. And maybe that's the part that's really haunted me all these years. The idea that sometimes nature doesn't explain itself, and that the things we find, no matter how far inland or how deep in the forest, might remind us how little control we really have over the world around us. I had never gone camping alone before. I'd always been with friends, family, or at least one other person, someone to split the quiet with when the woods started to feel too big and too alive. But that weekend, I decided I needed a break. No phone signal, no people, no noise. Just me and an old rented cabin at the edge of a state park, surrounded by thick forest that went on for miles. The cabin was small, one room, old wood everywhere, the kind that creaks if you breathe too hard. It had a little porch, a rickety metal bed frame, and a wood-burning stove that hadn't seen use in years. It smelled like pine, dust, and the faint mustiness of wood that had soaked through too many rainy seasons. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the light was starting to turn gold. The forest was quiet except for insects and the occasional crow. It was peaceful in a lonely sort of way. I unpacked slowly, stretching out my sleeping bag on the bed, setting up a lantern, organizing my small pile of food and water on the counter. I wasn't planning to hike far, just to spend a couple of nights off the grid. The first few hours felt nice, a little strange, but nice. I sat outside with a small fire going, eating from a can and listening to the woods. The crackle of firewood, the faint whistle of wind through the trees, a few rustles of movement in the undergrowth that I figured were just squirrels or raccoons. When the sun went down, everything changed. The forest gets dark in a way that feels heavy. You don't notice how much light the sky gives you until it's gone. I turned on the lantern inside the cabin, and it cast long shadows across the walls. The wood creaked constantly, like the place was breathing slow, uneven. Every time I shifted in the bed, something creaked in another corner. I told myself it was just the wood contracting in the cool air. Sometime past midnight, I woke up. No reason I could name, just that sudden snap from sleep into full alertness. The lantern had burned out, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the window. The cabin was silent. My heartbeat felt too loud in that silence. I lay still, listening. The air felt different, cooler, thinner. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Not loud, not violent, just the soft, slow crunch of footsteps on leaves. I froze. It was close, right outside the cabin. The footsteps paused, then moved again. A few steps, then stopped. The wood of the porch creaked. I held my breath. The bed was only a few feet from the window, and though the curtains were drawn, a faint shape passed in front of the light. I stayed still, every muscle tight. The sound moved again. Another slow step on the porch boards, a shift, like weight moving from one foot to the other. Then silence. After a minute, I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing around. The woods were full of them. But something about the pattern of the steps had felt deliberate, heavy, measured. I waited for a long time, eyes wide open in the dark. Finally, when nothing else happened, I drifted back into a half-sleep, the kind where you're never really sure if you're dreaming. When morning came, the air inside the cabin was cold, and the light was thin and gray. I went outside. The ground was damp from dew, and everything smelled sharp and fresh. There were tracks in the dirt near the porch. Not boots, but something larger than an animal. It was hard to tell. Maybe just impressions where the soil had shifted. But it was enough to keep my stomach tight as I walked around. I spent most of that day trying to shake it off. I went for a short walk down a nearby trail, took some photos, tried to enjoy the stillness. The forest was beautiful in daylight, the trees stretching high, sunlight filtering through leaves. It was easy to pretend that last night had just been nerves, the imagination playing tricks. By late afternoon, I was sitting on the porch again, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees. The quiet came back the way it always did. Slow at first, then all at once until it felt like the world was holding its breath. That night, the air was warmer. I left the lantern on low, its glow soft against the old wood. I read for a while, then eventually drifted off, the faint chirp of crickets fading as sleep pulled me down. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke again. Same as before. Sudden, alert, heart pounding. The lantern had gone out. The cabin was completely dark. This time I heard something different. Not footsteps, but the sound of something scraping lightly against wood. It came from the side of the cabin, slow and uneven, like fingers dragging along the wall. Then a soft thump, then silence. I didn't move. The air felt thick, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. After a long minute, I reached for my phone, though I knew there was no signal out here. The screen light felt too bright, too loud in the dark. The scraping came again, closer now, near the window. I slid off the bed slowly, keeping low, moving as quietly as I could. My hand brushed against my flashlight, and I clicked it on, aiming it toward the sound. The beam caught the window for a split second, and something moved just beyond it. A shadow, quick, low, gone before I could make sense of it. I waited, breath held, the beam of light shaking slightly in my hand. Nothing, just silence again. I must have stood there for 5 minutes, maybe 10. Eventually, I turned off the light and sat back on the bed, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chest, staring at the window. My body wouldn't relax. Every small creak of the cabin felt amplified, sharp, deliberate. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I remember waking again to pale light coming through the window. Morning. The first thing I did was go outside. The air was cool and still. I walked slowly around the cabin, the damp ground soft beneath my boots. On the wall near the window, I saw faint marks. Long, thin scrapes in the old wood, not deep, but fresh. It looked like something had been dragged along the surface. Near the porch steps, the dirt was disturbed again. A wide area of flattened grass, and just beyond it, faint tire marks. Like an old truck or ATV had turned around there in the night. The tracks went back down the trail, fading into the distance. I hadn't heard an engine, but the ground told a story I didn't like. That was my last morning there. I packed quickly, every sound of the forest suddenly too loud, too close. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire time. Even when I got into my car, I couldn't shake it. Driving back down that dirt road, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving behind me. But there was nothing, just empty woods and the cabin growing smaller in the distance. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it really was just an animal, maybe someone had driven by out of curiosity. But the sound of those steps, the way they paused, the scrape on the wall, none of it felt random. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed now and the house settles or the wind moves through the eaves, I think about that old cabin and the way the wood creaked around me in the dark. I think about how, for a few long hours, it felt like the forest wasn't empty at all. I had wanted to experience solitude, to see what being truly alone felt like. And I did. Only now I know that even when you think you're alone out there, you might not be. When I was a Boy Scout, maybe 14 or 15 years old, I went on a camping trip with my troop that I'll never forget. It wasn't the kind of scary you tell around a campfire to spook your friends. It was the kind that stays in your bones afterward, the kind that makes you realize how small and unprepared you really are in the wild. We had set up camp deep in the woods at the base of a small mountain range. The air had that crisp bite of late autumn, cool enough that you could see your breath at night but not freezing. The ground was covered in layers of old pine needles, and the smell of sap hung in the air. We'd been hiking all day, packs heavy, legs sore, but the spot we picked was nice. Flat, with a creek running not far away and plenty of trees for shelter. We pitched our tents, collected firewood, and by dusk, the place was lit with the soft orange glow of a few small campfires. That night, as the sky started to darken, I sat near my little camp stove, cooking dinner. It was one of those small, silver ones that hiss quietly while they burn, and I remember focusing on the flame, watching it flicker under my pan of noodles. The forest around me was dimming, the light bleeding away faster than I expected. The air had gone still, just the occasional sound of crickets and the faint trickle of the creek in the distance. That was when I heard it. It was a scream, sharp, high-pitched, and distant. It cut through the woods like a knife, echoing between the trees. For a second, I froze. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. A woman. It came again, a little longer this time, full of something that sounded like panic. My heart kicked hard in my chest. I looked toward the trees, trying to figure out where it came from, but the sound bounced and shifted, like the forest was throwing it back at me. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the noise. The sky was fading into that bluish gray that comes right before full dark, and the shadows were long and deep. The forest floor crunched under my boots. The sound came again, closer this time, and it made my stomach twist. It didn't sound right, it wasn't quite human, but it was close enough that it triggered every instinct to help. As I moved farther from camp, the smell of smoke faded, replaced by damp earth and pine. The woods thickened, and the light from the fire behind me disappeared completely. Every few steps I stopped and listened. The scream came again, then silence, then another one a little farther to the right. I turned in circles, shining my flashlight, trying to see something, anything. At one point I was sure I could hear someone moving, the sound of twigs snapping, like someone stumbling through the brush. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I thought maybe a woman had fallen, maybe gotten hurt. The idea of finding someone injured out there alone pushed me to keep going, even though something about it all felt wrong. The screams kept coming, but they didn't sound desperate anymore. They sounded strange, almost like they were being repeated, mimicked. Each one slightly different, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but always just close enough to sound human. I remember stopping dead in my tracks at one point, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand, thinking, what the hell am I walking toward? I was about 10 minutes out from camp now, deep enough that the trees closed in tight around me. The forest was darker there, quieter too. The screams had drawn me toward a small clearing surrounded by old, twisted trees. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and fallen branches. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing off the trees. It felt like it was right in front of me, but when I shone my light forward, there was nothing there, just empty woods, still and silent. Then another sound, a low, drawn-out growl, faint but unmistakable. It rolled through the clearing like thunder, low and vibrating in my chest. My flashlight caught movement above me, just a flicker, something shifting in the branches. I tilted the beam up, slowly, until it landed on two glowing eyes staring straight down at me. For a split second, my brain didn't register what I was looking at. The eyes were large, wide apart, reflecting pale yellow in the light. Then I saw the shape around them. A long, sleek body stretched across a branch, muscles coiled, tail hanging low. It was a mountain lion. It was maybe 15 feet above the ground, perfectly still except for the slow flick of its tail. Its fur blended into the bark, and if it hadn't moved, I might have never seen it. Its face was pointed right at me, and in that moment, I knew exactly what those screams had been. The noise that sounded like a woman crying out, it had come from that thing. Mountain lions can make sounds that mimic human screams when they're calling or warning, but hearing it out there, not knowing, had been the most unnerving experience of my life. The thought hit me all at once, that I had walked straight toward it, completely blind, because I thought someone needed help. I didn't move. My light stayed on it, my breath shallow. It was watching me, its ears flat, body tense. Could have dropped down in a heartbeat, and I wouldn't have had a chance. I backed up slowly, step by step, trying not to make noise. Every sound in the forest had disappeared. Even the crickets had gone quiet. When I got far enough that the trees blocked my view of the clearing, I turned and ran. I didn't think. I just ran. My flashlight bounced wildly, catching bits of brush and trunks flashing past. My lungs burned, and every rustle behind me made my chest tighten more. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of our campfire through the trees. By the time I got back, I was shaking. My friends were still sitting around, talking, completely unaware that I'd almost walked into a predator's den. I sat down hard on a log, trying to calm my breathing, listening to the sounds of the forest again. The screams had stopped. Everything had gone quiet, like nothing had ever happened. Later that night, we could still hear faint cries echoing from the distance. But now that I knew what it was, they sounded different, deeper, wilder, almost taunting. The fire crackled, and every now and then, I'd glance into the woods, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again. When morning came, we went to check the area. The clearing looked ordinary in the daylight. just a cluster of old trees with thick branches overhead. But near the base of one of them, we found large paw prints pressed into the soft dirt. The size of them made my stomach drop. They were fresh, clear, leading off into the brush where the ground sloped down toward the creek. Seeing those prints made it all real. The thing I'd seen wasn't a trick of the dark or a sound my imagination had twisted. It had been there, watching, calling, waiting. The rest of that trip felt different after that. Every time I heard a noise in the woods, my body tensed up. The idea that something that big, that silent, had been sitting above me while I was walking under its tree was enough to keep me wide awake that night. The forest didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It felt alive in a way that didn't care about us. I think about it sometimes when I'm outside at night and hear distant animal calls. It's easy to forget that the woods don't belong to us. That out there we're just another piece of the landscape, small and unimportant. That night taught me how quickly the line between curiosity and danger can disappear. One sound, one decision to step into the trees, and I could have ended up as something's meal. It still gives me chills when I remember looking up and seeing those eyes, glowing in the beam of my flashlight, realizing how close I'd come. We weren't the hunters out there. We never were. When I was 17, I went camping with a few friends deep in the woods, farther than I had ever been before. It was supposed to be a fun weekend before the end of summer, something reckless and memorable. We had hiked almost 3 miles off the main trail, carrying everything on our backs: cheap tents, a couple of sleeping bags, some snacks, and a few tabs of LSD that someone's older brother had given us. We thought we were doing something adventurous and wild, just a bunch of dumb kids looking for an experience. The sun was already sliding down when we finally picked a spot to set up camp. It was a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, the kind that looked like they'd been standing there long before any of us were born. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp soil and pine. We dropped our bags and spread out, kicking through leaves and clearing small branches. We were loud, laughing, trying to look like we knew what we were doing even though none of us really did. Someone suggested taking the LSD right away so we'd be peeking when night came. That felt like a good idea at the time. We tore the small pieces of paper in half, placed them on our tongues, and waited. I remember feeling the air shift. Not in a supernatural way, just that strange buzz that happens when the drug starts crawling through your body. The woods seemed sharper, the light slightly more golden. Every sound, the crunch of our boots, the far-off rustle of animals, felt close and alive. We didn't make the fire. That was our first mistake. We kept saying we'd do it soon, after we finished setting up, after we explored a little, after we laughed at how weird everything looked. Time started to slip by in that drugged, stretchy way where minutes and hours don't mean much. It wasn't until the light began to fade and the warmth drained from the air that any of us noticed how cold it had gotten. The woods went from golden to gray, and the shadows under the trees deepened into black. We tried to start the fire then, fumbling with damp wood and a cheap lighter that barely worked. My hands were shaking a bit, not from fear yet, just from the cold and the strange pulse of the LSD making everything feel both too real and slightly off. The air smelled different, like wet bark and rot, and there was this faint metallic taste at the back of my throat that wouldn't go away. It was getting darker faster than we expected. The kind of darkness that doesn't fade gradually but falls all at once, swallowing the woods. Our small clearing turned into an island surrounded by thick black walls of trees. Every sound stood out. A snap of a branch, the faint wind moving through the canopy, something rustling somewhere unseen. The cold hit harder. I could see my breath start to fog in front of me. We were crouched near the pile of wood, trying to spark something with the lighter, when I noticed movement on the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, just shapes shifting in the dark, the LSD bending the shadows. But then I saw 2 figures step out from between the trees. They weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were men, real, solid, rough-looking men. Their clothes were torn, layered with dirt and old stains. They looked like they had been living outside for a long time. Both of them were arguing, low but angry, the kind of tension that carries even without words. I remember the way they moved, sharp, erratic, like their nerves were frayed. The first one had a wild look in his eyes, his beard long and uneven, and his jacket hung off him like it had been soaked and dried too many times. The second was older, bald on top, with deep lines cut into his face. They didn't seem surprised to see us. They just stopped a few feet away, looked around the clearing, then looked at us crouched over the useless pile of sticks. For a few seconds, I didn't breathe. The air felt too heavy. The LSD made their faces shimmer slightly, but I could still see everything clearly enough to know they were real. I could smell them, that sour, sweaty, unwashed smell that's impossible to mistake. They started muttering to each other again, and one of them made a motion toward our pile of sticks. I remember feeling frozen, unsure whether to move or run. Instead, I just stayed still. They walked right past us, close enough that I could see the dirt under their fingernails. One of them crouched by the wood, pulled out a lighter that looked half broken, and started arranging the sticks like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The other man kicked a few larger logs into place, breathing heavy through his nose. It took them less than a minute to get a small flame going. The fire crackled, orange light pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal their faces. They didn't look at us again until it was burning steady. Then the older one glanced over, his expression hard to read. Not friendly, not threatening, just tired. They turned and crossed the clearing, stepping into the trees on the other side without saying another word. For a long time, none of us moved. The fire popped, throwing sparks up into the dark, and the sound of their footsteps faded into the woods. I remember the strange relief of warmth on my face, mixed with a kind of fear that sat deep in my stomach. I kept watching the spot where they disappeared, half expecting them to come back. We stayed awake most of that night. The LSD kept everything spinning just slightly off-center. Every branch crack, every whisper of wind felt like footsteps. The firelight made the trees look alive, their shadows stretching and twisting like arms reaching toward us. None of us spoke. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the forest move. When morning finally came, it was quiet, almost too quiet. The fire had burned down to a pile of gray ash. I walked around the clearing, looking for any sign that what we saw was real. There were footprints, large, boot-shaped prints leading from the edge of the trees to the spot where the men had stood. They were clear, pressed deep into the soft earth. I followed them to where they'd started the fire, then across the clearing to where they disappeared into the woods. I pushed through the trees for a while, trying to see where the prints went, but they stopped after a few yards, fading into the undergrowth. There were old cans and pieces of trash scattered around. A torn sleeping bag, a rusted tin, a dirty blanket tangled in roots. Maybe they had been living out there. Maybe they still were. We packed up not long after that. No one really said much on the way back. The air felt heavier, the woods less friendly than they had on the hike in. Every now and then I thought I heard movement behind us, but when I turned around, it was just empty trees and sunlight breaking through the leaves. Back home, the whole thing sat in my mind in a strange way. It didn't feel like a dream, but it didn't feel like something that belonged in normal memory either. We all remembered the same details, the arguing, the fire, the smell, the way they looked right through us. None of us thought it was a hallucination. The LSD wasn't strong enough for that, and no drug could make footprints in the dirt. The thing that still bothers me even now is how they seemed to know. They walked out of the woods at the exact moment we were struggling to light a fire, told us we should have had it going, and then did it for us without hesitation. They didn't ask where we were from, didn't care what we were doing. They just appeared, fixed the problem, and left like they had other places to be. Sometimes I think maybe they were just two men who had been living rough for too long, moving through the woods and happening upon us by chance. Other times, it feels stranger than that. Not supernatural, but something in between human instinct and pure coincidence. Maybe they had been watching us for a while. Maybe they waited until it was dark enough, cold enough, until we were too scared or too high to do anything about it. I still go camping sometimes, but never that deep. I like being able to see other campsites nearby, to know there's someone else within shouting distance. Every time I build a fire, I think about that night. About the moment when two angry, tired men stepped out of the woods like they belonged there more than we ever did what we couldn't, and vanished again into the dark. I don't remember the high anymore, not really, but I remember the smell of smoke, the flicker of orange light on their faces, and the sound of them walking away into the trees, calm, deliberate, like they had done this before, like they always would.